Good afternoon and good morning to everyone that has joined us for this month's LinkedIn Live with Joe Marshall and Lee McIntyre Hamilton. So we're talking about the UK tax update for payroll and HR, and obviously we've got the globally mobile employees. Have I said that right? I have, haven't I? Lee?
Yeah, or digital nomads is easier, less of a mouthful.
Yeah, digital nomads. So thank you very much for joining us. How are you both today, Joe and Lee?
Good, better than the weather, Mel. It's absolutely pouring it down here in Yorkshire.
Yeah, rain's holding off here in southeast London, but it isn't glorious, let's put it that way.
I know, we will get summer soon. We had a taste of it, didn't we? But we will get there. So those of you that have joined us that are not based in the UK, our obsession with the weather is still carrying on.
And rubbish.
Yeah, and hopefully it will change. So if you do have any comments, please add them to the comments section on the LinkedIn Live, and we can always come back to those post session. And it would also be really great to hear from where you're based, because we do have people from the UK, but we do have people that join these sessions that are based abroad. So from a geeky point of view, I love seeing where everyone comes from. So I'm going to turn off. So we're going to change it slightly this month. And Joe, you're going to start today's session. So we'll see you in a minute, Lee.
Great. So thank you, Mel. Thank you, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone. And of course, welcome to this afternoon's session. A bit of a change around, as Mel said. I'm going to start off first, if that's okay with everyone. We're moving straight into UK payroll. And we've had a few changes, haven't we, over the last, since our last podcast. So the first one, of course, is the fact we've had a budget. We had the spring budget on the 6th of March. Now, if you did attend, of course, the GPA summit on the 7th of March, we did a high-level change, of course, on what we're expecting for the new tax year. So just kind of bringing that into play here for the session. What we're looking at, of course, as far as the new tax year is concerned, it's this reduction in NI again, isn't it? Luckily, it is from the 6th of April, so that's always good news. But this reduction, of course, we're paying slightly less national insurance. It's jumping down from 10%, which has been since the 6th of January, coming down to 8%. So coming on with a little bit more money, which is always good news, isn't it? We were just chatting, of course, very political. We know this is because of the general election this year. Whether that's enough to turn the points, we shall see. But that's certainly for us in payroll. That's the main thing for us to bear in mind. Remember, there's no change for the secondary. The employers remains at 13.8%. No change there, unfortunately. If you do deal with things like, self-assessment, you might have workers, of course, where you've got the self-employed rate. That's also been reduced. This follows on from, of course, the 22nd of November last year, where they, of course, decided they were going to reduce the Class 4 national insurance from 9% to 8%. Well, of course, on the 6th of March, they reduced it even further to 6%. That's from, again, the start of the new tax year, 6th of April 2024. So a nice reduction there for the self-employed. It's all about the voters. The final one is our friend Jeremy Lewis. I was going to say it's Martin Lewis, of course, and this is something he's been campaigning for a while, the high income child benefit charge. So the way this did stand, and of course his campaign about this was about your income. And if you're over £50,000 in theory, then you're starting to lose your child benefit. So that's the bit they've changed. So just to explain how this kind of did work, if your salary was over £50,000, that's, as a one parent, then for every £1 you earn over, £200 you earn over, you would lose 1% from your child benefit. So that's the first thing they've changed. They've increased that threshold to £60,000. So it's anything over £60,000. Now every £200 you earn above, you will lose 1% from your child benefit. So that taper kind of drags you out then to around £80,000. So HMRC, again, it all comes back to the employer bulletin, are obviously promoting this, and they're explaining to employers to maybe advise employees or to let employees know that if they are above the £50,000, they may have stopped claiming the child benefit, but they can claim it again. So they may be eligible. It's worthwhile, of course, communicating that maybe to what I call those high earners. The other thing, of course, is following consultation. This is the other thing that Martin Lewis was campaigning for, which is how this is based. This is based at the moment on each parent, isn't it? but they want to change that so it's more to do with the family, so the household itself, what's the income for the household, but that needs to follow consultation. So we're expecting potentially that change coming in April 2026. So just a little catch up there, of course, on the 6th of March and that announcement from the spring budget. But let's move back on to, of course, the employer bulletin. That's always what we're covering off in these sessions. And it's the first one, of course, it's the national minimum wage. That reminder, it came on board on the 1st of April 2024. It's a whopping £11.44 per hour, 9.8% increase. It's a huge jump, isn't it? But the other thing to bear in mind here, and it is that reminder, they've reduced the age. So that level, we sometimes call that the national living wage. And that's now coming down to 21-year-olds and above. So it's a big chunk, isn't it, for the business? And I always say this every April. It's not just this kind of, per hourly rate. Of course, you're timesing that by the number of hours worked in the week over the year. Then, of course, how many employees are affected by that. Then we've got the employer's NI. Then we've got the employer's pension. We've got the apprenticeship levy. This thing just goes up and up, doesn't it? And you'll be aware yourselves, as we've covered this in previous episodes. All of those thresholds are frozen. So things like your apprenticeship levy, they're all frozen. There's no change for them coming into that new tax year. So again, you're going to see more and more businesses sadly paying more money across for those items. Also, of course, noted down in the employer bulletin in previous episodes as well has been this, changing of the bands, isn't it? So as somebody changes age, so they change from, of course, 17 to 18 years old, they will then go on to that £8.60 per hour. So have your triggers built into your system, whether that's on their date of birth or running a report for the pay reference period. But we need to pick up on the fact, of course, somebody potentially needs to increase their pay. This then ties into, of course, the educational bulletins, as they're referred to, or as we call them, the naming and shaming. It's tying back to things like salary sacrifice. We did talk about this in the summit quite heavily with Jenny, and it's a key one. Don't get trapped by this, because you might have things like pension salary sacrifice, cycle to work, childcare vouchers for those that are still in it. But electric cars are a big scheme. Lots of employers offering that as a salary sacrifice scheme. And it's getting people caught out. So do your checks if you've not done so already. Do your checks. But that then leads us on to, of course, what's the future looking like? We always like to look to the future, don't we? Be proactive. Yeah, £11.89 is their current prediction or projected rates for next year, for next April. So we shall start to see this come through. This is low pay commission. And of course, a target of trying to eat this 2/3 medium ultimately for the hourly rate, so that we kind of come out with this almost average. We're expecting that probably more autumn time. Again, we know we've got the general election, but fingers crossed in autumn, we'll get that confirmation of exactly where that's going to come through. But yeah, just keep an eye on it, guys. Do your checks if you've not done so already. What else have we got? We've got this. This was also noted in the employer bulletin. So a few of us were aware of this prior during the consultation last year, but HMRC did note it down in the employer bulletin. This is in the March edition, by the way, and this is about changes to RTI. So they want to add more information to RTI. So i.e. we've got to provide more information to them. I've been saying this since 2013 and it kind of rings true. It feels like Big Brother watching, and this very much is the case. So what are we expecting? Well, it's all to do with the hours that people are working. We kind of provide this information to a certain extent now. So within your payroll software, there'll be an option where it shows kind of contracted hours per week, and you've got these bands that you can select from, so less than 16 hours, more than 16 hours, etc. So we kind of, select an option, if you like, within a range. But what they want is actual hours coming through. So we had some draft legislation issued out to us, I think it was back end of March, where it is detailing down, even for salaried workers, for the pay reference period, what hours have been paid for that pay reference period. That's including things like overtime, etc. So big call here, isn't it? As far as the software is concerned, I'm thinking about April next year. How are we going to convert that? Because we haven't, maybe have some payroll software does have that data, but for those that haven't, how do we get that information into the system? So have a look through your payroll now, see what information you're holding and whether or not we can pull that data into, of course, for RTI submission. Maybe summertime, start to have a chat to your payroll providers. Get prepared for it. April before we know it. It'll be Christmas before we know it, won't it? So let's get prepared now. They have added on, of course, the concept, which is true, where we will have employees who've been paid, but there's no hours. We're not actually paying them for hours worked. So, you know, kind of the standard would be statutory payment. So we can note those things down. A big one, though, is going to be directors, isn't it? I do this. I've got a couple of directors, payrolls that I run. We don't really record the hours, do we, that they work. They just get probably a nominal fee sent through. So within those, we're going to have to make changes to their records as well, potentially, of course, come April, which is where, of course, we'll have to note down that they are a director. That's the reason why we haven't noted down actual hours worked for that pay reference period. But as it said on the previous slide, it very much is Big Brother watching. We're now providing information in essence, which is national minimum wage, isn't it? So we're telling them the amount we've paid, the number of hours that they've worked. Will that lead on to further investigations? We shall see. We've also noted down that there is a £60 penalty for failure to provide the required data. So it's very heavily on your payroll providers. I know they've already started kind of scratching their heads to work out how they're going to work with this and moving forward. So as I said, maybe leave it summertime and start to have a chat to your payroll provider if you've not done so already. The other one, of course, that we have in the employer bulletin is that reminder about the investment zones. These are referred to as the special tax sites now, of course, that's lumped in with the free ports. This is now being extended as this programme. It's going on until I think it's 2034. So it's being extended from 5 to 10 years. So there's lots of, and this is all about the growth, isn't it? It's about growing the economy, etc. So that's where they're coming at with this. And with that, they have certain incentives for businesses to invest in these particular areas. From our point of view, of course, payroll, it's the secondary NI. So it's the relief they receive. So if we just kind of move on to that next slide, this is what we're going to see in our payroll. Probably there already, of course, we are on the 9th of April. But you've got new NI category letters there. Depends on your payroll software. You might have to tick an option to say you're in the investment zone area or the free port area, but you will see these NI category letters appear at that point. It's all to do with the employer. It's all to do with the secondary contributor. It's less than the upper earnings limit. It's coming in at £25,000. It's literally a mirror image of the free port. So for us in payroll, yes, we know it's our job. We've got to pick the right NI category letter. But the fact is, of course, we need to understand from a business point of view, don't we, what's the business doing? So if they are investing in one of the free port areas or, of course, the investment zones, we need to feed this information through to the payroll team and, of course, pinpoint those employees that are ticking these particular boxes. So hopefully we can use those NI category letters moving forward. It's not going to be for every business, is it? Let's be honest, but we will have hopefully some businesses that will decide to invest in those areas. For the employee, no change. It's exactly the same as, dare I say, us, everyone else, the standard, and that's coming in at 8%, of course. Anything above the upper earnings limit, they'll drop onto that 2%. So just an awareness of those 4 new NI category letters that are coming on board. The next one, of course, noting down in the employer bulletin is it's just around the corner, isn't it? It's the P11D processing. We'll be here before we know it. So a couple of things to bear in mind. If you dealt with this last year, of course, you'll be aware this year it's online only. They're not accepting any paper. I know last year they were posting them back to the employers. So unfortunately, no paper formats permitted now. So it's online only. What are our options? Well, you can use commercial software. Of course, is a key one. If you don't want to pay for that, because of course you've got pros and cons to each of these. If you don't want to pay for the commercial products, then you can use the HMRC's online services. It kind of logs you back into, I call it the business tax account. But you're signing with your government gateway. It'll permit you now to submit up to 500 P11Ds. But that's all manual. Sadly, there is no import facility. So unlike your commercial software, which is going to allow you to import the data, it'll do the calculations for you. Of course, that's what we're paying for with the product. This is very much like paper, but online. So it's not really doing a huge amount of calculation for you. So you've got to do that prep up front and put the data into the system. If you use this function last year, then in your employees that you entered there will be there for this year. So you might have to have a bit of a clean up, remove the levers, put the new starters on. But then once you've gone through that, then it's putting in, of course, your benefit data against those employees. Remember to do the P11DB. And that has also been the reminder from HMRC. So if you have nothing to declare, don't forget to submit the P11DB. That's the nil return, isn't it? and you can use the government gateway to do that. It's the same with the PSA1. Again, if you have a PSA in place, that can all be submitted through the government gateway. It's doing the legwork up front. It's doing all like those calculations and prep up front so that we can hopefully just input the data ready for transmission. Your other one to bear in mind is the new company car calculator. So they've had one online for years now, but they've updated it. So again, in the employer bulletin, they've noted down the new link, the new URL that will get you onto that new calculator if you want to take a look at that. The other thing to bear in mind, even if you are using commercial products, is if you need to amend a P11D. So let's say you've processed the P11D, you submitted the data online, you've then realised you've made a mistake, you need to send the amendment through the government gateway. There's no other way of doing it. You are completely overriding the original P11D. So this is the reminder again from HMRC. Let's say you've got two benefits on the P11D, you've got private medical and company car, for example, then you realise after the submission you've made a mistake with the private medical, it should have been a different value. With the amendment, still put the company car on because it's going to completely override that original submission. So don't forget to put everything on there. It's like a brand new submission that you're sending through to them. When you go through that process, you've got 28 days to complete the process itself for the amendment. So hopefully enough time to get those changes in. But that reminder again, if you're amending a P11D, and certainly if it's of course a Class 1A benefit, remember to amend and send an amended P11DB as well. So spreadsheets might help, certainly if you're having to recalculate things, just to make sure, of course, we're sending the correct information to HMRC. And of course, that final reminder is the fact that it's been a leap year, hasn't it? This time, or last tax year was a leap year. So remember any pro ratas, again, your commercial software will be doing the 366, but it's a reminder if we're doing this manually to do the same thing. And then finally, just before Lee gets started, we talked about this last time, of course, in the last session, but it's noted again in the employer bulletin. And of course, it's this mandatory payrolling of benefits. They're confirming again, they're saying to us 25-26 will be the last year for those P11Ds in most cases. Therefore, moving forward for 26-27 will be payrolling of benefits. The other thing that I did pick up on, a few of you might have done this as well, is agents. If you are a payroll bureau agent or a payroll agent and you act, of course, on behalf of clients, we've never been able to complete that registration for voluntary payrolling of benefits. So I was part of a pilot group earlier on this year, and it looks like they're moving it onto the agents' accounts as well. So we can now start to do that, but not till May. So it's from May 2024, which means, of course, because they won't allow those informal agreements, that it'll be 2025 tax year when those agents can volunteer to payroll their clients' benefits. So whether or not that's going to be needed, because it's interesting, is it? Will that actually be needed in 2026? Will we need to register? Lots of questions outstanding still as far as this mandatory payrolling of benefits is concerned. I know we've had a couple of articles from some of the payroll groups out there, and they are challenging HMRC at the moment to change legislation now sooner rather than later. I understand HMRC's views being, let's hang fire, we'll make this live first and then we'll change the legislation. No, let's do it now, let's do it before we get started. So lots of changes. We do know it's not going to be the same. So if you are volunteering to payroll your benefits at the moment, mandatory will not be the same. Certainly things, very least expectation, we know the Class 1A national insurance will have to go through the payroll, suspecting very much they will want more information about the benefits that we're reporting at the moment. It's generally just a value unless it's a company car. So interesting times ahead. Look out for further guidance and details coming out on that in 2024. But yeah, mandatory payrolling of benefits is only 2 years away, guys. And there we go. So hopefully perfect timing for Lee.
Perfect timing, Jo. Fantastic. And thank you very much for a very informative session.
My pleasure, Lee. My pleasure. Are you okay with the slides? Do you want me to click through for you?
Yeah, you better do that because I think you've got control on your side of the ticker.
Great stuff. Thank you, Lee.
So welcome, everyone. And I thought I'd finish up today by talking about globally remote workers and having a brief update in that area. If we just turn over the slide. Thank you, Jo. Wonderful. So yeah, there's been some proposals in recent months by the European Economic and Social Committee essentially around how the world deals with globally remote workers, or digital nomads is another subset of that group. What do we mean by globally remote workers? For those who aren't familiar, it's essentially where you've got an employee working in one country, but their employer is based in another country. And of course, during the pandemic, this became, it increased in prevalence around the world as people returned to work in their home country. But it's a continuing trend. And with, technology as it is now, plus the pressure on costs for businesses and physical real estate, it's a trend which is bound to continue. And I think the whole globally remote work issue is interesting in so much as it affects all employers of all sizes. So I work with businesses which only employ a dozen people, but they're recruiting somebody to work remotely in the USA, or they might be recruiting somebody or a team to work for them from Spain. So it's an issue which affects companies of all sizes. Now, clearly what's happening on the global front, and this is thinking big picture and going forward and in future, is that the tax authorities globally are clearly concerned that they're losing out on tax revenue when it comes to globally remote workers. Plus, it's harder for tax authorities generally to collect tax from globally remote workers. And why is that? Well, because when you've got somebody who's, let's say you've got you're employing somebody remotely via a UK employer, but that person, let's say, is based in Spain, working from a villa there or such like. Tax in that scenario would be due, income tax this is, in Spain, where the person is resident in Spain and is working in Spain. But there's no employer there. So it relies on that individual to register with the Spanish tax authorities and then to pay the right amount of tax. Now, of course, that might be done by some people, but not by everyone. But also, when somebody's in the country, for example, just for a year and then they're going somewhere else, it's even harder then for the authorities to collect tax and make sure that it's being paid correctly. So there's this drive, I think, globally to look at the rules as they currently stand and ask the question, are we taxing people in the right way when they're working remotely or indeed working cross-border in any shape or form? So there was a report out last year by the UN Tax Committee, which looked at this issue, and this recent report by the WESC committee, the European Committee, is also looking at the same thing. And what they have suggested in their proposals is that where you've got somebody who's based overseas, then they should be taxed in the first instance in the country in which the employer is resident. So in my example there, where you've got a UK employer, but you've got the employee sat in Spain, it would be the UK employer who has the responsibility to operate tax in the UK in that example. They're then saying that it's unfair then to the Spanish authorities because they're losing out on their cut of the tax. So it would then become the UK employer's responsibility to essentially allocate tax between Spain and the UK in that example, or indeed between any other countries in which the individual is working. So it's important to say before everyone panics that there is no immediate plan to change the rules. If you think about it, these agreements have to be agreed by all the major tax authorities globally, and the principles which are being espoused by the EESC and also the UN are a real big departure from our current way of operating. So it means some huge changes. But I raise it for two reasons. One is because it shows the direction of travel, that actually this area of globally remote work is going to evolve. And it's important, I think, for employers to kind of keep an eye on that. Because these things, can evolve over time, which may affect your policies and what you allow employees to do internally and so on. But also, I think it highlights the fact that tax authorities are really looking at this because they're in fear that they're going to lose revenue because of globally remote workers. So it highlights the current compliant challenges, I think, of globally remote workers, and that if you're not doing already, then it's really an area that should be looked at and is worth keeping on top of. For some companies, that means putting in place a policy. which determines, are you going to allow people to work remotely overseas? If so, for how long? Are you going to limit the countries in which they're working? Through to organizations which may allow it for just 1 or 2 people, or indeed those who don't allow it but just want to monitor the position to make sure that people aren't unintentionally or unwittingly or unbeknownst to the company working in another country. So if we move to the final slide then on those current issues, next one again, I've covered that. Thank you. So there I've summarized some of the key issues when it comes to globally remote workers, because I know firsthand that people in payroll will get asked to become involved in the setup of payroll overseas for globally remote workers. And unfortunately, it's just not that straightforward. So if you've got somebody based overseas, or indeed many people based overseas, whether or not payroll is required in the overseas country is dependent upon a number of factors. And essentially, there's 2 main avenues, right, for tax and social security. One is that you're required to have a payroll in that country, and therefore tax, social security is collected via withholding, or the individual needs to settle it themselves, via filing an income tax return and registering with the tax authorities as an individual in that country. Now, generally, that is not a choice. So one of the first things with these kind of scenarios, if you're sat in payroll, is to work out, do I actually need a payroll in that country? So that is based on an array of different factors, and that's what creates the complexity in these scenarios. So very briefly, if you don't have a company in the country in where the individual's working, let's say our individual in Spain is in their villa, you don't have a company in Spain. So the first thing that would need to be considered is whether their activities in that country unintentionally trigger what we call a permanent establishment. Essentially, that's the Spanish tax authority saying that individual's activities, although you're not registered here, they trigger a corporate presence for you. So they deem there to be a corporate presence. The significance of that from a payroll point of view is that that will almost certainly trigger then payroll obligations for that person, because they're saying you're not registered here, but in essence, we're going to treat you as being registered here from a corporate tax perspective, but also from a payroll point of view. There are also the EU social security rules, meaning that even if you don't have, in that example there, a company in Spain, the UK company, the UK employer, would still be obliged to register as a foreign employer in Spain in order to operate Spanish social security, where you've got somebody living and working indefinitely in Spain. That's under EU regulations. We're still signed up to them via the Brexit agreement. So there are those to consider for EU nationals. Reciprocal agreement countries, there are countries where we've got reciprocal social security agreements, which also will decide whether UK national insurance is due or social security is due overseas. Increasingly, there's a number of countries which have mandatory registration requirements for foreign employers. So Canada is a good example I always use, because they, for a long time, have required foreign employers to register and operate payroll where you've got somebody living and working in that country. So even if you've not got a company registered in Canada, even if you don't trigger a permanent establishment there, you're still required to register with the authorities there as a foreign employer and operate payroll. So the number of countries which have those kind of mandatory foreign employer registrations is definitely increasing. And I think it's all around trying to hold employers accountable, even when that employer is not based in the country in which the employee is living and working. Also, don't forget that where people come back to work in the UK, they might be in Spain or Canada or wherever else in the world. Even if they're non-resident and you are employing them, if they're coming back to perform duties in the UK, you are still going to have a pay-as-you-earn obligation at the very least, assuming that those duties aren't incidental. So that's the other thing to watch out for. And finally, of course, payroll means tax, social security, but there are a host of other issues to consider with globally remote workers around immigration. Do people have the legal right to work in that country overseas? Employment law. Often when people are within a country for a long period of time, they will acquire employment rights in that country. So that's something to watch out for as an employer. And there are other issues like employer insurance and so on in the overseas jurisdiction. So an evolving area, and one that we'll be keeping an eye on, and I'll update you as things progress over the coming years, more likely in this area. In the meantime, if you've got globally remote workers, worth keeping on top of them and also reviewing the compliance position if you haven't done so already. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Joe. That's all I have to cover today.
Well, thank you. That's actually a lot's been going on, hasn't it, since we last spoke? Especially on...
Yeah, and I think with the globally remote work issue, it's actually a global issue. So I use the UK example because I'm sat in the UK, but for all our international callers, wherever you're sat in the world, this is going to affect you and affect how your compliance and how you operate payroll. Yeah,
and then obviously we've had the budget, and then potentially, we mentioned this before we went live, we are going to have an election, but we don't know when, so that's going to be all change again. So we haven't sat still since COVID, really, have we?
It's interesting, Mel, because I keep saying, we've been saying it for a few years now, this freezing of the threshold, but still so much else goes on in the payroll world. So even those kind of basic calculations, all that kind of hasn't changed. There's plenty else going on, really, isn't there?
Yeah, payroll is always evolving, No, well, thank you to everyone that's joined us. We've had a great audience today. If you need to get in contact with myself, Lee, or Joe, feel free to message us directly from LinkedIn, or if you do have our email addresses, please feel free to email us. But we look forward to seeing you next month, and take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.